So we have quite a bit of things going on, right, with the training in North Carolina for the first half of this year with the webinar schedule I just went over, and the SureBet trainings and SureBet 3 coming your way in the last week of March. Okay, so now let's talk about why you've tuned in today. Today's session, I will tell you, is not going to be a clinical training. It's going to be more coming from a macro standpoint. It's going to be more informational, okay? And it's going to come from several resources, global resources. Basically, what I took with this webinar, or what we had, is what we had in the BDA library, which, again, those of you who have sat with us and worked with this for years, we used to be BDA. We're now Morneau Chappelle, but I took what we had in our BDA library and beefed it up. Of course, made it, made sure I modified it, made it current, and added a few things too. And we're going to look more in depth, and we came up with these objectives for you. Now, some of this might serve as review, or better yet, it might be new helpful information for folks that are on the line today. But either way, we hope this information is going to give you maybe some increased perspective, some more knowledge, so that you can better serve your problem gambling clients who either have criminal behaviors tied to their gambling or who have been incarcerated, who suffer from this disorder. Now, again, as I said earlier, if you have any questions, chat me. And then if we've got some time at the end, I'll try to open it up. If not, just chat me and we'll look at those chats and get you the information via email. So first, we're going to look at prevalence rates from the United States Department of Justice and other worldwide resources. Not only are we going to look at prevalence rates of problem gambling in our prison system, but we're also going to look at rates or how problem gambling and gambling disorder is related to criminal behavior. I think that's important to hit on today, since we are talking about incarceration in the penal system. Then we're going to attempt to identify some reasons why the prevalence rates are reportedly higher in correctional facilities. Specifically, we'll talk about gambling as a form of escape for inmates and those tendencies of criminal behaviors that can be connected to problem gambling and gambling disorder itself. We'll then seek to understand the relationship between gambling and criminal behaviors, specifically looking more in depth to make some potential connections and identify that overlap you might find interesting, or there's really actually 3 overlaps. But I'll talk about those later, of course. Finally, we're going to look at some decisions or options that prison administrators look at when they set a gambling policy. Now, we're going to look at the 2 ends of the spectrum. We're going to look at harm reduction, and we're going to talk about abstinence, right? We all know about that in those 2 terms in that continuum in our field, right? Especially with addiction. So we're going to look at the issues that are involved with an abstinent program, and then also a harm reduction program if we carried that out. And then finally, I'm going to look at a study that was done in an Iowa County jail. Very small study, but it's somewhat recent, and I think it has some relevance to those who are incarcerated in their total rehabilitation program, especially if they suffer from problem gambling issues, okay? The agenda is kind of set into quarters. We're going to talk about 1/4 of its prevalence, 1/4 of its reasons for gambling in the penal systems. We'll talk about crime and gambling, and then we'll talk about the prison system and gambling. Okay. I think prevalence is a good place to start, right? And the United States Department of Justice, I know this says 2004, and it's true, but I think it's still relevant today. It's 3 to 5 times the rate than that in the general public. 13% had committed assault for money. They are more likely to sell drugs than other arrestees. And 1/3 admitted to robbery in the last year. Now, how would you think this is going to be tied, especially the last 3, to problem gambling and gambling disorder? I think the takeaway here is, number 1, the 3 to 5 times rate, the prevalence rate. In the bottom figures, the end all of crime when it's tied to gambling is money. It's not violence. Most of those who suffer from gambling disorder or problematic gambling behaviors their crimes are tied to money. I know 13% committed assault for money, which involved violence, but most of the time, the end all with crime that's related to gambling or supporting their gambling habit or addiction is tied to money. Now that stat fits that illusion that most of our problem gamblers or gamblers have with money and problem gambling. Now, this comes from a recent study in 2014, somewhat recent, with a global perspective out of Germany showing the higher prevalence rates among pre-trial detainees and prison inmates at the entry of the penal system or the prison system. I refer to these rates as higher because think about the prevalence rates. There's a lot of talk about prevalence rates in the problem gambling world. We still reference Dr. Howard Schaefer's Harvard study because it's been replicated so many times over the years. The prevalence rates out now that we usually quote are 2.5%, but what you're seeing here are percentages of valid screens that were positive, 6.6 starting with there, more than doubles that 2.5% of the general population. Looking down, and they were all given the live bet screening tool. Now, 7.3% of the 1,200 inmates recorded positive on a full-scale survey. I don't know, honestly, if that would qualify as a diagnosis, but another of gambling disorder. But looking at these numbers and comparing it to the 2.5% of those who suffer from gambling disorder in our country, you kind of get the point. Another point of significance is here. I know all the participants were male, predominantly male. It might have been different if some females would have been surveyed as well. But the bottom line here is these numbers almost more than double that 2.5% rate of the general population. And also to note, the severity levels weren't specified assessing to the DSM criteria because they could have been, a lot of them could have been mild, but they did screen positive. Now here's some numbers from Canada that are even higher, as you can see. And R.J. Williams wrote, he wrote some things on harm reduction policies and a lot about gambling in prison, but he found that as many as a third of criminal offenders that meet criteria for problem gambling, that approximately half of these crimes were committed to support gambling, right? So we'll talk about problem gambling or gambling disorder when it's comorbid with criminal behaviors a little bit later in the talk, okay? So why are these rates higher? Some of these might seem obvious, but let's talk a little bit more in detail of why. And yes, you've probably seen this screen before if you've sat in on any of my webinars anyway, or sat in on our SureBet trainings there in North Carolina. I think this has some significance. The DSM-5, the 9 symptoms or characteristics of gambling disorder. You just need 4 more of the following, but for a diagnosis. But thinking back to the characteristics and symptoms listed under the DSM-5, you know, think about being institutionalized in the prison system. I think this perhaps would set the stage for an inmate to use gambling as an escape to get away from it all. If you've either worked in the system, volunteered in the system, or even been in the system, you know that it's not comfortable in a county jail, prison, or state prison. I even think with the absence of pathology or any addiction or any mood disorder, anyone locked up in a correctional facility would want to escape that unsettling environment. They don't want to make it nice in there, right? It's a form of punishment that our society has developed for the good, the bad, or the ugly, right? But returning to our clients that are predisposed to gambling addiction or any addiction, it might be safe to say they are much more sensitive or vulnerable to these symptoms and wanting to escape from them than others. Now, here's a study that was done by a couple of guys, Dixon and Johnson, and they used a non-inmate population. You're asking, Robby, why do you have this on? Because it's going to make a point from the previous slide of escape. So these guys use this gambling functional assessment tool. It's called the GFA. It's acronym, and they assess gambling on 4 contingencies or 4 quadrants. One of them is a tangible outcome where they gamble for the money. The second contingency is for the social aspect. They just gamble to fit in or to have fun with their friends or other inmates. The other, if they're in prison. The other is the sensory experience. They do it for the excitement, the adrenaline rush, or fourth, they do it to escape. Now, there have been several studies using this GFA scale with these 4 quadrants or 4 contingencies, and frankly, there hasn't been any strong evidence to escape as being a primary reason for gambling per se. But it was found that those who did score on the escape contingency also had the higher probabilities and higher potentials for pathology. So how does that connect with what we're talking about right now, right? Think about that unsettling, unstable environment of jail or prison. And when you include the results of this study, specifically the presence of pathology with those problem gamblers that scored escape as that primary contingency regarding their behaviors or gambling behaviors, that would set the stage for those entering the system who gambled to pass the time, or more specifically, just to have a mental reprieve from that uncomfortable environment of prison, to be the prime candidates for gambling disorder or gambling addiction. Here are a couple other implications. If the inmate population turns to gambling as a means of escape from that crazy prison environment, then there's reason to believe that the rates of gambling disorder would increase after incarceration, which would result in sending somebody out, if they do get let out or released, into our society with a new addiction. That's the last thing we want to do. And if gambling disorder in the prison population is going to be treated, it would seem wise for practitioners to focus and keep an eye on escape as when we're assessing and even developing treatment programs, or even doing one-on-one counseling to kind of guide those clinicians in the system to be able to have their eye out for escape as being their primary reason. And if it is, we need to treat it accordingly. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about prevalence rates, talked about maybe some potential reasons of how they use gambling as an escape, or why the prevalence rates are, escape being one of them for higher rates. Now let's look at some common factors of gambling, problem gambling, and gambling behaviors. There are 3 overlap. This one study we found had 3 overlapping common risk factors of people who are incarcerated in our prison system and with gambling disorder. This could help us explain maybe, or give us a little bit of insight of why the rates are a little bit higher. The first one's age, and the prevalence rates of a problem gambler. Some studies show decrease with age. Now, I know there's a vulnerable older adult population to gambling, but also it seems to decrease with age as well. And according to the Bureau of Statistics, 56% of the male inmate population is less than 40 years old. For females, it was less than 66% of the inmates are less than 40 years old. So it strikes a lot of times at the younger years, gambling disorder, and a lot of our population in the prison system here in the U.S. are younger. That's one. 2, moving to gender, males report higher levels of problem gambling versus female. And the Bureau of Justice reported that out of a study in 2009, 1.5 million individuals incarcerated, 93% were male, so mostly incarcerated are male. And the higher rates, it's still, the female population I know is growing. We talked about that last year in a summer webinar, but I believe the males still dominate slightly, somewhat, but that's still another overlapping characteristic. And looking at our third risk factor of ethnicity, folks from different ethnic backgrounds report or suffer from problem gambling higher than the majority. Wardman, Gubley, and Hodgkins report that Native Americans display gambling disorder, pathological gambling, up to 15 times the rate of Caucasians. And the Bureau of Justice also reports that 1/3 of males that are incarcerated are Caucasian, and less than half of the female prison population are Caucasian, which translates to the majority of those incarcerated in our prison system, unfortunately, are of ethnic background. So these 3 kind of cross paths, these 3 risk factors, and with problem gambling, incarceration, which are ethnicity, gender, and age, and they can be maybe perhaps a reason why the rates could be somewhat higher. Now, along with some common risk factors, here are some more characteristics of problem gamblers that are incarcerated in the prison system. This comes from that same study I showed earlier out of Hamburg, Germany. Problem gamblers, inmates tend to serve longer prison sentences. They more often have a migration background, and the substance use prevalence rate or misuse is higher than problem gambling inside the prison systems, as it seems to be the same as it is outside in the general public. 81% of problem gambling inmates had debts compared to 60% of other inmates, of course. And to fund their gambling habits, you know, they committed crimes like theft, robbery, burglary. And again, those who committed violent crimes were more likely not to have gambling issues. Those with gambling issues, they usually committed less violent crimes because they're just wanting to get the money to support their habits. Here are 3 potential reasons that we resourced for another webinar that I put together a couple years ago on crime and embezzlement. Here's some other possible explanations of the higher prevalence rates of folks that are incarcerated. It's that impulsivity and sensation-seeking element of criminal behaviors and personality that are common with certain gamblers, like action gamblers. Also, the criminal background involves obtaining money illegally, and gambling can be viewed as like a shortcut to obtaining money very quickly. And along this same vein, crime is seen as an answer to fixing gambling-related economic crisis. So here the individuals use crime as that shortcut to fund their gambling habits, which fuels their need for that sensation-seeking, adrenaline rush, and impulsivity issues that often occur. Staying along the same path, I'm just going to tell you these next 3 slides, I'm just going to read some numbers from you from a study that was conducted in Hungary. It further shows the statistics that connect gambling, problem gambling, with criminal behaviors of those who are incarcerated. Now, we found the following statement from a journal to demonstrate the persistence of gambling behaviors despite the government's intervention of terminating gambling machines in Hungary. This just caused a shift in the type of gambling that the patrons chose there after their preferred gambling option was closed of scratch-off tickets, which are huge, right, in North Carolina. I believe my colleague pulled this, Jenny, which I liked her showing this, which kind of leads us into me reading some of these numbers. Now, the first study, it was one study, but they conducted a survey in 2009. Then they surveyed, did the same questions 5 years later on this population to show fluctuations in these areas that are being studied. It demonstrated some on problem gambling and or the pathology connected to the addiction and how this is connected to those who are incarcerated. Now, the percentage of inmates reporting no problem basically stayed the same, right? Maybe technically increased 0.7%. So those that reported no problem gambling in 2009 reported the same in 2014. The percentage of inmates at risk for problem gambling actually went down, which is great, 5% over the 5-year period. This could be interpreted by a few things, maybe a demographic change, or even inmates themselves might have changed their behaviors. Finally, the percentage of inmates with a gambling problem increased, okay, over the 5-year period. Perhaps this could be due to a change in policy, maybe a more harm reduction approach. So that could be some of the reasons why these numbers fluctuated. Now, these results show the increases and decreases over the 5-year period for specific criminal acts committed by problem gambling inmates. This could, again, help provide some insight on those prevalence rates that we stated earlier. So the rates of burglary stayed the same in the 7% range over the 5-year period. These reports, these inmates reported crimes involving violence decreased, which, as I said, makes sense. If they're problem gambling inmates anyways, they're going to be after the money. Those inmates that reported committing robbery decreased by 10%, but to no surprise, the problem gambling inmates that reported committing theft increased by 12%. And this, with theft, they're wanting the money to be able, the end all is to support the gambling habit. And finally, let's look at substance addiction and gambling addiction and how they played a role with those crimes committed by the inmates through 2009 and 14. Inmates reporting that alcohol use disorder or alcohol influenced their crime stayed about the same, or stayed exactly the same. Inmates reporting that their drug habit, substance use disorder, or that being under the influence of a drug, it rose from 19.3 to 21.4. And while those inmates reporting both alcohol and drugs influenced the crime that they committed, that actually fell as well. And with our focus and attention when it falls on gambling addiction, it fell as well, which is great. Again, I think the takeaway here is to look at how the overall percentages where gambling addiction falls when comparing to the substance addiction percentages. It falls third in influence. But that's no reason to turn our head to problem gambling and its connection to criminal behaviors. I think it mirrors what that is in the general population, these prevalence rates and the rates of how the addiction is tied to criminal behaviors, but it's something that we still need to keep our eye on. Another point of insight I think we can just briefly touch on is examining that crime connection in regards to the higher prevalence rates in those who are incarcerated, and talking about, is it the chicken or the egg, having that discussion. We've had this in past webinars when problem gambling or gambling disorder is tied to another mental health condition, or even we talked about it even being related to, or could be related to, violence in SureBet 3 back in 2018. And I think today's subject matter is no exception. I think determining if the problem gambling preceded the crime or came after the criminal act will definitely be helpful for clinicians when they assess, when they treatment plan, and when they provide their counseling and treatment to the overall rehabilitation of criminal offenders in the system. I think this further insight into the gambling crime connection might even assist issues of inmates developing gambling problems after incarceration as they relate gambling policy issues in correctional facilities. Another thing, I think it can help crime in our communities if we look at that. If folks if problem gambling is their primary, or gambling disorder is their primary condition behind the criminal behavior or the access to here, if that's connected, meaning that they're committing crimes to support their gambling, if we treat the gambling, perhaps those criminal behaviors might subside, hopefully, right? And one last look or quick note at the potential reasons or explanation of the prevalence rates of gambling in the system and where they are at now. I said this earlier, there are individuals might enter the system as problem gamblers. And one study, over a third of them that came in met the criteria for gambling addiction. And then there was another study that compared military and prison populations, and they found this to be true of those who were committing crimes when they compared that to the military population and their rates of problem gambling and gambling disorder. Okay, so that concludes our talk on prevalence rates, maybe some potential reasons, some insights and reasons related to the connection of some criminal behaviors with gambling. So now let's talk about policy. Specifically, should it be allowed in our correctional facilities? Now, here's some history behind prison policy and gambling. This might help you understand where we've come to today and where we're at with this. I think it all started in Nevada, out of all states, right? Where in 1932, they allowed prisoners to maintain an all-out casino. I don't know what happened in the early 30s. 1931, Nevada opened up legalized gambling. 1931, they legalized or allowed slot machines on military bases. And in 1932, they built a casino on a Nevada prison grounds. This prison included blackjack tables, craps, poker, sports betting, you name it. And it seemed everything was working out through the years. 35 years later, when Warden Carl Hawker, he closed the Nevada State Prison down because he viewed gambling as a non-constructive use of the time for inmates while they did their time for the state of Nevada. And furthermore, they kind of made it final by the legislation that was set in 1967, set up a bill shutting down that prison casino. Now, some would argue today that the resulting sentiments from Warden Carl Hawker in the Nevada prison system legislation from 50 years ago, they're still alive today. There are three things: gambling, and this is why. And you can agree or disagree with this, but gambling worsens prison violence. Gambling poses as a non-constructive form of prison recreation, as uh, uh, Warden Hawker had said. I think that was his original reason for shutting it down. And gambling in prison is negatively viewed by the taxpayers and or the public. That sets the stage of where or what we're talking about now. And on our talk on prison policy regarding gambling starting, we want to start with the considerations with an abstinent program. And before I get started with talking about both programs, I forgot to say at the beginning, I say this at all our shore bets that we're gambling neutral. And I say we here at Morneau Chappelle. I myself, I'm gambling neutral, not for or against gambling. We're just here to serve those who can't gamble in a healthy, functioning manner. Okay, and but so we're here to or to present, excuse me, both sides of the case today. Okay, now here are the more obvious reasons for an abstinent program. Now, if at all possible, we want to prevent inmates, obviously, from developing another addiction or an addiction while serving time. The last thing we want to do is enable more problems for those in our correctional systems and facilities when they leave. And if they develop a gambling problem or gambling disorder, it can be challenging to detect in prison. And if they develop these problems, they're going to face added complications after their incarceration while they try to reintegrate. They've got another issue to deal with. And we all know if you work in the problem gambling world, the resources, treatment resources are horrendous, right? That's why we do what we do. And finally, the results of an unpayable debt, I would say everything from a federal prison to a county jail, maybe even a city jail, can get someone killed, right? Another obvious thing is it disrupts the prison population, and violence can break out when it comes down to not paying up on a wager. So that's a little bit on an abstinent program. I'm going to talk more in depth about a harm reduction program. So with legal or allowed gambling, here's some facts from a DJ Williams article that showed how gambling plays a role in the prison environment and how inmates utilize gambling actually to the function of the system itself. 40% of prisoners in a research sample reported that they gambled while they were incarcerated. Gambling takes many forms, and folks who are incarcerated get very creative with creating dice. They play bingo, card games, sports betting on occurrences within prison, fights, basketball games, exercise, who can do the most pull-ups. Gambling makes things a little bit more interesting. As I said earlier, it's a form of escape. It just, it's a form of recreation. They gamble, folks who are incarcerated gamble for everything from gambling for money to sexual favors to commissary items, which is a big wagering item, specific tasks. And many female participants reported that they gambled to try to escape that they're actually separated from their children. And then in prison systems, there's a hierarchy of crimes, right? And that means that sex offenders are at the bottom. We probably all know that. It can be very dangerous for a sex offender behind bars, or any type of offender who, a sex offender or someone who has, where there's a child involved or there's violence with a child, but especially with a sex offender. A lot of sex offenders gamble to fit in, to keep themselves safe behind bars. So that's how gambling can serve, I don't want to say as a purpose, but it serves to utilize itself within the system. Now, as I said earlier, gambling serves as an outlet for fun and recreation for prisoners to help them maybe escape where they're at or escape their what they did. And DJ Williams reports that there's less and less correctional recreational activities available in the current system. It can play a positive role in offender rehabilitation. It can make incarceration more bearable if that's the goal. Provides a sense of personal freedom, enjoyment, positive emotions, use of skills, and self-expression. It can keep the peace, if you will, right? It can tone things down and keep, maybe not too much, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, but maybe moderate amounts of gambling. A harm reduction policy includes allowing gambling at certain levels to operate in the facility. Williams provides some practical suggestions here, okay? Like I just said, maybe we can moderate some things, providing a wide range of recreational options in addition to gambling to avoid gambling as being the sole or main form of recreational activities that are being offered to the population. This will lessen some of the potential drawbacks of a harm reduction policy. Now, if gambling is allowed, Williams suggests that you screen offenders entering the system for gambling disorder criteria to avoid worsening an inmate's condition or avoid creating disruptions or other problems that result from someone who has this addiction. Along the same vein, there should be the appropriate resources available to treat any problem gambling issue or problem gambling that might arise due in part to the policy. And finally, Williams suggests here that prison inmates be prepared to be flexible in their thinking, flexible in developing additional policy to support and maintain the overall harm reduction, be ready to change some things and to tweak them as needed, because there surely will be the need for controls to be put in place when perhaps if this is set to go. Now, here are some more examples of supporting or surrounding a policy suggested to complement a harm reduction policy and system. As I said earlier, we might want to permit, or administrators might want to permit casual gambling to some limited degree, like the types that they can gamble, the types of games they can do, what they can wager, how long they can play, to be on the lookout, the guards, to prohibit excessive frequent playing, or to watch what happens if someone doesn't pay a debt. But there comes a lot of work with a harm reduction policy. Administrators have to maintain an open and educational stance. Let's see here. They need to provide the entire population, as I said earlier, a wide array along with the gambling option of other recreational leisure activities, and they need to assess problem gamblers who would require the assessed problem gamblers. They need to make sure that they guide them or require them to not gamble, to send them to another way of doing a recreational activity versus gambling. Now, in addition, I don't want to repeat myself, but we need to assess for problematic gambling behaviors when individuals come in. We need to provide counseling and treatment services to prison population. And we also need to develop awareness and educational services, not only to the prison population, but to the staff. I mean, everything from administrators to prison guards to, responsible gaming or responsible gambling type of trainings to support their harm reduction stance or harm reduction policy. Now, some more risk and challenges. Here, these are inherent. I think if a correctional facility wants to take on a policy that permits it, Steiner reports that inmates committed fewer infractions when they held favorable beliefs regarding the facility rules and staff to enforce them, which I think is something important to remember when we set policies around any type of harm reduction policy to allow prisoners to do certain things. In other words, a lot of folks who are incarcerated respect the rules and those who enforce them a lot of times. But first off, remember a few slides ago we presented prison administrators and staff eventually or should develop the appropriate policies to help keep gambling activities to certain controlled levels through limiting the types, games, and wagers, for an example. But that can become a very slippery slope when you start thinking about it. So this is definitely something prison staff, administrators, and decision makers need to think about when they're considering or even before deciding to implement a harm reduction policy to allow gambling at any level in their prison. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time and more money, I would imagine. Secondly, and unfortunately, sometimes this particular population doesn't respond favorably to harm reduction policies that foster responsible compliance. In other words, this type of policy might have the potential to be exploited by inmates because it's inconsistent with a lot of the more firm and sometimes rigid policies that a lot of prisons generally set in the past with no wiggle room. And by the way, there's a reason for that because of how criminal behavior you know, a lot of time the prison population will push and test prison guards. So, you know, it can be, again, it can take some time and effort. And with these policies designed to support allowing gambling in prison, they can sometimes be perceived to be levied with inequality. Or the prisoner might have that distortion where, hey, this isn't fair, when it really is. Because if gambling is allowed in some capacity or some level in a prison system or in a jail, then there is always that potential where an inmate will see it this way. Or a scenario where they're being punished for something, for breaking a rule, and part of that punishment is they can't go gamble, and they're seeing others gamble, and it's unfair, and then things can disrupt and burst. So if something is allowed and they're punished against it, this can create discrepancies and problems and issues that can come with having a harm reduction policy in their system, right? Okay, so that's a little bit about an abstinent program and setting an abstinent program, some things we need to think about, and more about a harm reduction program. Frankly, there was a lot more on harm reduction, what I saw, and I thought, and honestly, I thought it was interesting too. I was like, wow, but I think it would take a lot of time, a lot of effort. You know, I don't know. Again, I'm not taking either side there, but these are some things we just wanted to bring up the considerations when you're setting a policy, whether to allow it or not, and what you would, something to think about, what you would support. Now, we want to conclude today with an action research project from an Iowa County jail that my colleague Jenny Opals had resourced. I think it's a very small study, but I think it's somewhat recent, and I think the results might have some implications for larger institutions that support policy in regards that use the correctional system actually as a platform to assess and treat gambling disorder during incarceration and at release. I mean, if our goal is true rehabilitation in our system, wouldn't treating an individual's gambling addiction or any addiction be a part of the rehabilitation process? I mean, don't we want to make our folks who go in to these institutions better? I know punishment is part of it, but if we can make them better folks for our communities coming out, I think that should be a goal anyways. And so this was conducted from mid-August 2014 through mid-September 2014. And a transition coordinator whose role was to connect community supports to offenders to facilitate service provisions upon release. They completed these assessments, and they actually used the brief biosocial gambling screen to examine past year gambling behavior during the past 12 months. Have you become restless, irritable, anxious when trying to stop or cut down gambling? During the last year, have you tried to keep your family or friends from knowing how much you gambled? And during the last year, have you had financial trouble as a result of your gambling that you had to get help with living expenses? So if you answer one to any of these, it's a screen, remember. So this isn't a diagnosis tool, but it's a very simple and effective tool. But if you answer one to any of these, you know, this means that perhaps we need to look into this a little bit more, right? Now, I think this study, when I kind of read the results or, you know, looked at this, it brings to light, I think, what we already know. I say we everybody on the call, or we who work in the problem gambling world know that we have an awareness problem. Low awareness of the problem itself, okay, because prevalence rates, what, are 2.5% of the general public, and low awareness and low treatment resources too, right? So 21% of the sample endorsed one or more of the items on the screen, indicating the need for, we have a referral there, but the need to assess more, I think. And of these, 6 were referred for a professional evaluation, 2 were released outside the service area, and 5 of them were admitted. I know 5 doesn't sound like a big number, but when you look at the baseline, it was an increase from 0 admissions in the past year. Okay, so think about 5 in the 2-month period in the time span. You do the math. What is that in a year? Now, that translates into 30 referrals and possible admissions for the year. Now, imagine these results in our larger state and federal institutions. These percentages would then translate to hundreds and maybe even thousands of, and it could probably help lower criminal behaviors in our communities. Why? Well, we talked about this earlier with the chicken or the egg, whether the problem gambling disorder comes before or after actually an individual starts committing the crime. If they're committing crimes to support their habit, logic tells us if we depending on the nature of the comorbidity, if we treat the gambling disorder, the problem gambling, help with those distortions, perhaps it can help lower crime in our communities. If we use the system as a, let's say, as a resource, it perhaps could help. That's some of my take on that, and I apologize, but we could use this perhaps maybe to help our communities' crime rates and to help those who are institutionalized who suffer from this disorder or addiction. Okay, so it looks like I'm right on time here. Now, I'm going to do a review, kind of an extensive review, because this has been a very, we covered a lot of numbers, studies, not only from the US, but the world. But let's talk about this, and perhaps I can open up. We'll probably have a few minutes if you have any thoughts on this. So first, we talked about the high prevalence rates. We reviewed several rates of prevalence regarding problem gambling worldwide in prisons. I think the takeaway here is that the overall prevalence rates of problem gambling exceed that of the general population. One reason we talked about was to escape that aversive environment of the prison itself, and maybe the need to escape themselves and their situation altogether. Then I linked together problem gambling, remember, with criminal behaviors. I talked about the overlapping, those three risk factors of being incarcerated with gambling addiction, which were age, gender, and ethnicity. We then talked about those potential reasons why gambling is higher amongst prisoners than the general population from that crime and embezzlement resource I spoke of. Remember the impulsivity, sensation seeking factor, the criminal lifestyle factor connected to getting money illegally, a shortcut, and a crime that's seen by an individual as a quick fix to an economic issue, a crisis, or a gambling-related crisis. We showed those resulting figures from the study in the Hungarian prisons that connected gambling and crime, which included the percentages of inmates at risk for problem gambling and those percentages of inmates without a gambling problem. We looked at the different types of crime that committed by problem gambling inmates, and then discussed the role that addictions, both substances and gambling, played in those crimes committed from 2009 and 14. Remember that study. We talked about the importance behind determining whether gambling caused the crime or if the crime caused the gambling in regards to assessing treatment for someone with gambling disorder that is incarcerated. And that goes even without saying, even if they're not incarcerated, as far as crime rates go. Our final potential reason for the higher prevalence rate in our correctional system is we found that a third of the offenders entering the system met the criteria for problem gambling or gambling disorder itself prior to walking into the facility. And remember, one of those studies compared the military population with the prison population, and I believe that's what they found too, that it's the folks that are coming into the system, they already are assessed positive for perhaps having a problem gambling issue. And that's when you say, hey, maybe this is tied to the actual criminal behavior itself, right? And then we talked about gambling policy options just here recently. We looked at the pros and cons and considerations of an abstinent program or disallowing gambling in a jail or prison by maintaining an abstinent policy. A facility could potentially avoid that higher potential with this policy of folks developing gambling problems or the other problematic issues that arise tied to gambling, like unpaid debt resulting in violence or even death to an inmate. We then talked about how gambling positioned as a leisure or recreational activity could be utilized as maybe a positive function in the system as a whole. We then looked at the considerations and those responsibilities when you do allow it in a prison, offering multiple recreational options, not just the gambling option. Two, conducting consistent screening procedures for incoming inmates. And then three, providing the appropriate resources to treat problem gambling and gambling addiction. And Fourthly, we talked a little bit about being ready to develop additional policies to support this harm reduction stance on gambling. They're intended to serve controls to allow the types of gambling activities, what they can wager, how much they can wager, limiting the types. And again, this is a slippery slope. I can't imagine trying to control that or setting those up, but I think that comes with it, with a harm reduction policy of allowing inmates to gamble. And finally, in that last section, I talked about that action research project in the Iowa County Jail that we believe would have implication on a larger scale if it was done at a state and federal level versus a small county in Iowa, right? I mean, those numbers could explode. And it could help crime in our communities, perhaps, if we treat the gambling disorder itself. Okay, so I covered quite a bit. Now, before I'm going to open this up, I think we have 5 minutes here, which I'm right on time. I'm impressed with that, actually. Let me see here. Okay, I'm going to. Does anybody have? Well, let me do it this way. Does anybody have any comments or wish to talk? Just chat me. And while I'm waiting on that, I want you to know that we did record this session, and it will be on the UNC website, the behavioral health website, where you can get this recording. So again, it's the UNC behavioral health website, Springboard, which we will have it recorded. So any thoughts, any questions on what we covered today? It was a lot. I'll give it a minute. Looks like we have 14 participants on today. Well, it looks like we don't have it. I don't have see anybody chiming in on the chat. Let me check one more time, just if anybody has anything. Okay. Well, we just have 3 more minutes, but if we don't have any thoughts or any questions, we look forward to our next webinar, which is February 27th. Dr. David Ledgerwood will be speaking, I believe, on impulsivity, but again, we're excited to have him back, and we're excited for our whole training, our webinar campaign that's coming up with all our great guest speakers. And then I'm also excited about being in North Carolina in April for the SureBet 1 and 2 that we're adding to this year. And then also the SureBet 3, the last week of March, where we'll be doing gaming in the college experience. Thank you for sitting in today. I hope today was informative and helped in some way in what you do. And everybody have a nice day. Thank you.